I've been asked this one question more often than any other in connection with my YouTube channel. Do you think Richard III was evil? At first glance, it seems like a simple yes or no question. And if I had to bet, I would expect to find correspondingly clear answers in the comments. However, it's not quite that straightforward, for several reasons. First, two other questions are often used interchangeably with the question of Richard's villainy. Do I think Richard III killed the princes in the Tower? Do I think the monstrous caricature of a villain presented to us by the Tudor chroniclers and William Shakespeare is plausible? And this is where the difficulties begin. It is entirely possible that Richard did not kill the princes, but was still evil. It's more difficult the other way around. Once he has murdered the princes, his reputation can hardly be salvaged. Parts of Tudor historiography may be true, even if others are not. Philippa Langley was confronted with this possibility in a dramatic way when, together with the team from the University of Leicester, she found the bones of the last York king. It took her some time to recover from the shock of seeing Richard's curved spine. We know so little about Richard that it's almost impossible to arrive at a definitive conclusion about whether or not he was evil. And this doesn't even address the problem that we must first clarify what exactly it means to be evil. But it's just almost impossible. Welcome back to Lemmy History. Richard III apparently only allows for extremes. This has always been the case in history. William Hutton's remark in 1788 that some people ascribe to Richard an angelic excellence, while others only know how to draw him in the blackest color, is as true today as it was then. Hutton demanded that both sides of Richard's personality be considered. Historians of our day have become much better at this task, but they have also failed to a certain extent. In popular culture, the heroic Richard has long overshadowed the physically disfigured tyrant. It is more likely that Richard was neither wholly good nor wholly bad. So how can we reconcile these two sides of Richard to avoid replacing one propagandistic caricature with another? The question of whether he was evil seems promising in this regard. Ultimately, it forces us to examine Richard's actions in a nuanced way. We'll clarify exactly what this means in a moment. Michael Hicks already moved in a similar direction when he sought to illuminate Richard's motives for his actions, rather than simply reproducing the motives that have been imputed to him. Before we explore this question in depth, however, we must address the proverbial elephant in the room, which we've already briefly mentioned. The unexplained fate of the princes in the Tower makes it practically impossible to regard Richard as good without reservation. There's a reason Richard's fiercest modern defenders go to such lengths to convince us that the princes survived. This is the only way he can be completely absolved. Even if someone else was the murderer, Richard would still be haunted by the dark shadow of having been their protector and having failed in that role. This is especially interesting considering that it is indisputable Richard ordered the deaths of certain men, some of whom were completely innocent, such as Thomas Vaughan. However, these actions do not automatically render him a villain. This leads us directly to the question of what it actually means to be evil. The common definition is, reprehensible is what is morally wrong. Morality refers to the normative orientations by which we guide our lives. We know what is commonly considered good or bad and act accordingly. However, the definition of malignancy in this form is a bit too brief. In this case, the decisive factor is social morality, not personal morality. Those who commit acts generally perceived as bad can often still morally justify them to themselves. Richard, for example, felt entitled to execute William Hastings because he considered him guilty of treason. However, there was never a trial. In Richard's eyes, Hastings was a threat to him and his family and therefore had to die. Social morality is subject to constant change. Today, we consider some things evil that were unproblematic in the past, and vice versa. For example, Richard proudly led one of his brother's invasion forces into Scotland. At that time, he was celebrated as a great general. Richard dreamed of launching a crusade of his own. In our time, the public response to such plans would certainly not be entirely positive. The question of whether Richard was evil must therefore be judged according to the social morals of his own time, not ours. For us, the answer is easy. Measured against the moral ideals of the 21st century, it would be difficult to find any medieval or early modern king who lived up to those standards. By modern standards, Richard III would be considered evil for his deeds alone, which are indisputable. What happened in Stony Stratford in 1483 and thereafter, we would now call kidnapping and murder. But our morality was not the morality of his time. For us then, the key question becomes, did Richard III satisfy the social morals of his time or not? Not every moral violation is equally serious. Richard had 2 illegitimate children. He thus violated the moral ideals of his time, but not gravely, since he recognized and cared for them. That these were, nonetheless, breaches of prevailing morality is already evident from the fact that these children did not hold the same legal status as legitimate siblings. Still, these violations do not automatically disqualify Richard as a good person. Only the potential murder of the princes carries the weight to render all else irrelevant. Infanticide and the murder of close kin were as unacceptable then as they are today. Otherwise, judgment remains open, provided Richard's justifications are convincing and his good deeds form a sufficiently strong counterweight. Here, too, morality provided a path. Violations could be redeemed by repentance and personal responsibility. Richard acknowledged and cared for his illegitimate children. We do not know whether he also repented, and we will not be able to determine this for other transgressions. We must therefore exclude this aspect from the analysis. So the rule is this: could he excuse his misconduct in a way that met the social expectations of his time? And did he perhaps perform such commendable acts that they overshadowed any unexcused transgressions? Kings, for instance, were informally allowed considerable freedom in their private lives so long as they ruled well. Edward IV's amorous pursuits, for example, extended well beyond the bounds of marriage. This only became a serious issue when his rule grew increasingly complacent, corrupt, and indulgent. In the 15th century, Christian values dominated moral concepts, but these were increasingly challenged by humanism and the early precursors of the Reformation. As a result, political elites in particular turned even more decisively toward the Church. On the Iberian Peninsula, for instance, a new wave of anti-Semitism emerged. The English, for their part, were confronted with a new form of Christian fundamentalism that operated outside the established Church, personified in the figure of Joan of Arc. It was a time of upheaval and violence. The Wars of the Roses and the 100 Years' War were as significant for England as the invention of the printing press. Christianity served as a moral anchor for both individuals and society as they sought to process these rapid changes. Reflections of this reliance on faith can also be found in the literature and theatre of the time. The 15th century is often culturally described as a barren time, but this characterization is unjust. The so-called moral play was widely popular, marked by the personification of virtues and vices. In these productions, morality was made literal. Audiences were shown which traits were to be emulated and which condemned. The messages were predominantly religious in nature, aiming to instruct through dramatized moral contrast. Additionally, ballads gained increasing prominence. Indeed, literary historians often refer to the 15th century as the century of ballads. These were often not entirely new compositions, but were rooted in oral tradition, frequently evolving from folk songs. Ballads drew clear lines between good and evil, and in many cases, ended tragically. Their themes encompassed love, death, war, heroic deeds, miracles, and crime. Over time, works with mystical and supernatural content also became more widespread, reflecting the era's fascination with the unknown. What we can observe clearly through these cultural forms is how social morality was constructed. People were seeking answers, ways to interpret a rapidly changing world and cope with recurring experiences of violence. Christian and authoritarian messages continued to serve as moral compasses. However, these messages were increasingly generated and reinforced by society itself. Broader social participation served as a multiplier. Through theatre attendance, market day performances, or simply by orally passing on the content of a ballad. Because of the ongoing wars, there was no longer a single, uncontested authority defining moral standards in what was a chaotic time. To put it simply, a person could be loyal to Henry VI or to Edward IV, but not to both. The most important building block of Richard's personal morality reflects this very circumstance: loyalty. This value was so central to him that he crafted his personal motto around it: "Loyalty binds me." Unfortunately, he never specified to whom this loyalty was owed. His life ultimately demonstrated that his loyalty had its limits. He did not shy away from open conflict with his brothers. He had significantly more difficulty with George than with Edward. Rumors even suggest that he considered disowning his mother by declaring Edward illegitimate, though he ultimately refrained. He is also said to have contemplated leaving his wife, Anne Neville. Yet according to current knowledge, he never had a mistress during their entire marriage. His books offer a bit more insight into his moral compass. They reveal the sources of his ethical orientation. Among them were religious texts, 4 works we would now classify as romances, and several chronicles. Notably, he owned 2 books that were personally dedicated to him: William Caxton's translation of the Order of Chivalry and William Worcester's Boke of Noblesse. These texts reflect the core of Richard's interests: chivalry, historical consciousness, nation-building, Christian faith, and heroic love stories. Among them was the Prophecy of the Eagle, a key work used to legitimize the House of York's claim to the throne. The recurring values in these works, aid to the weak, justice, loyalty to one's family, and devotion to God, reveal a consistent moral framework. The entertainment-oriented texts often featured figures like Tristan, who fought for righteous causes. Particularly telling for Richard is the story of Tristan and Isolde. Isolde was intended to marry another man, Tristan's uncle, King Mark. However, a magical potion causes Tristan and Isolde to fall irreversibly in love. On the journey to her wedding, several incidents occur. Suffice it to say, Isolde does not arrive as a virgin bride. The lovers do not receive a happy ending. In this tale, 3 key values of medieval literature are prominent: honor, loyalty, and the tension between love and incompatibility. The love portrayed here is not focused on fulfillment, but rather on service, fidelity, and reverence. This stylized ideal likely resonated deeply with Richard. The Richard III Society commissioned a psychological profile of the king during the search for his remains. The study was conducted by Professor Mark Lansdale and Julian Boone, both psychologists at the University of Leicester. At the outset, they made an important disclaimer, one that we should also emphasize. Conducting a retroactive psychological analysis over 500 years later is fraught with challenges. At best, it can offer approximations. Lansdale and Boone reject the image of Richard as a tyrannical monster. However, they identify certain personality traits of interest. He may have suffered from what is called intolerance of uncertainty, often rooted in early childhood experiences. This condition can manifest as excessive trust, rigid moral principles, and heightened sensitivity to perceived threats. Such traits might have led Richard to exhibit obsessive tendencies and a strong desire for control. He also demonstrated authoritarian behavior, and before Ricardians object, as stated, this analysis appears on the website of the Richard III Society. I've included the source in the description. Richard's childhood was shaped by instability and loss, notably the deaths of his father and brother Edmund. Experts also suggest that his scoliosis may have influenced his personality. His wariness and suspicious nature could stem from anxiety. He likely anticipated negative judgment from others because of his physical condition, and in turn perceived others negatively. This could have impacted his overall social interactions. From this, the researchers deduce that Richard's piety, success in battle, emphasis on justice, decisiveness, verging on fatalism, honor, and sense of duty were all central to his self-image. My interpretation of this analysis is that Richard was so convinced he would be judged negatively due to his appearance that he worked tirelessly to persuade others to see past it. He committed himself to moral ideals that might allow him to transcend superficial judgment. This commitment also involved a clear understanding of the difference between law and justice. Richard recognized that existing laws could be unjust, and that true justice could sometimes stand in opposition to the law. Moreover, many people were excluded from achieving justice through legal means. When Richard spoke of loyalty, he likely did not mean loyalty to a particular person, but to justice itself. And inevitably, he became the arbiter of what justice meant, just as we all do in our own minds. In Richard's case, however, this led to a particular kind of aggressiveness. He assumed people would reject him, and that assumption became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Richard grew controlling and authoritarian, which ultimately caused others to dislike him. Richard's personal morality was therefore only partially congruent with the social values of his time. Today, we would likely see this as a virtue. Richard demonstrated an ability to look beyond rigid class boundaries when appointing officials. With William Catesby and Richard Ratcliffe, he promoted two individuals clearly beneath him in rank because they had proven themselves and because they were wholly dependent on him. This, however, provoked resistance from powerful noble families who felt overlooked. One off-cited example of Richard's supposed moral integrity is that he did not violate the church sanctuary at Westminster when Elizabeth Woodville and her family sought refuge there in May 1483. But it is possible he had done so earlier. After the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471, Lancastrian supporters fled into the sanctuary of a local monastery, which was subsequently breached by Yorkist forces. Richard was present that day. However, we do not know the extent of his involvement. He is also presumed to have overseen the assassination of Henry VI in the Tower. Yet again, this act was carried out on the orders of his brother Edward IV, not Richard himself. Still, he did not object, at least as far as we know. The same holds true for the execution of George in 1478. While governing the north, Richard protected pirates. In at least one known instance, ships from Flanders were attacked and looted by men directly under his protection. Although Richard did not personally issue the orders, he blocked any legal action against them. This was particularly troubling, given that overseeing maritime law enforcement in the north was one of his official duties, explicitly assigned to him by his brother. Richard could argue that Edward had previously tolerated piracy, but in this case, his actions were not coordinated with the king. As far as we know, he acted without Edward's direct approval. Of course, it's possible private conversations occurred that were never documented. Richard used these pirates strategically to consolidate control over northern trade. He leveraged his relationship with Edward IV to enrich himself politically and materially. These actions went beyond any defensible notion of justice. They reflected an aggressive, authoritarian approach. For example, Richard intimidated the Countess of Oxford into surrendering her lands. He falsely claimed that the land had already been transferred to him and that she merely needed to provide the official documents. Afterward, she was coerced into signing over ownership formally. This act took place on the grounds of a nunnery, which Richard and his men entered without invitation. Incidentally, their base of operations was the house of Thomas Vaughan, who, not long after, accompanied the young Edward V to Wales. Vaughan was among the men executed by Richard in 1483. He had no notable connections to the Woodvilles, apart from serving as chamberlain to the heir apparent. These actions are difficult to justify. Richard gave reasons, of course. The Countess might aid her traitorous son with her wealth. The land would help him fulfill his duties in the north. He also knew the king could have intervened, but did not. Ultimately, however, this episode amounted to arbitrary enrichment at the expense of someone weaker and unable to resist. It is a stark example of how Richard's moral decisions often served his ambitions, and how those ambitions sometimes led him into deeply questionable territory. Richard treated the families of his brothers in a similar way. He cared for George's son and daughter, but also appropriated much of their family's property. He did not reinstate Edward Plantagenet in the line of succession, although he is believed to have considered it. Elizabeth Woodville remained in sanctuary at Westminster with her daughters until March 1484. During that time, Richard took legal action that effectively destroyed their position. He publicly declared the children illegitimate. Through the law known as titulus regius, he had them excluded from the succession. Their status, possessions, and titles were stripped away. Westminster Sanctuary itself was sealed off by Richard's men. Anyone wishing to leave had to surrender to him. He did make some effort to compensate for this. Richard reached an agreement with Elizabeth Woodville to allow her daughters to leave Sanctuary. He promised to find them suitable husbands, and he did begin the process. However, strong rumors soon emerged about his relationship with Elizabeth of York. These grew so intense that he was ultimately forced to remove them from court. Richard also persecuted Jane Shore, his brother's former mistress. Without intervention from the Privy Council, she might have been executed. This was the fate that befell William Hastings, who had been Edward IV's closest friend. Richard accused Elizabeth Woodville of witchcraft, an argument reminiscent of Tristan and Isolde. In his version, Elizabeth, in this case some kind of scheming Isolde, gave Edward the magic potion herself, without his knowledge. Elizabeth was never granted the chance to defend herself in court, nor was Hastings. Even Richard's wife's family was not spared. He arranged for Parliament to declare Anne Neville's mother legally dead, thereby gaining access to her estate. She was also held under house arrest for a time. Richard could justify this by pointing to the actions of Anne's father, the so-called kingmaker, Richard Neville, who had once betrayed Edward. In the end, Richard simply secured control of his wife's inheritance, which he managed in her name. Compared to the standards of the time, Richard could still appear somewhat merciful. The wife of Humphrey of Gloucester, for instance, was permanently banished for witchcraft. Nor was it unusual for the lovers of deceased kings to be persecuted. As for the children of George, Richard was not directly responsible for the loss of many of their rights. He simply chose not to restore them. Richard's dedication to justice, however, is hard to discern in his personal relationships, just as his much-valued loyalty can be difficult to trace in practice. It could be argued that Richard believed he needed to act with strength in order to deliver justice. But ultimately, that is speculation. We cannot read his mind, only his actions. This brings us to the princes in the Tower and their defenders. This refers to the men who accompanied Edward V to London, but were intercepted, arrested, and ultimately killed. At the time, these were an uncle and a half-brother of the king. It was an extreme act, but not without precedent. Edward IV had his own brother George executed. Edmund Tudor, the half-brother of Henry VI, died in captivity at the hands of Yorkist troops. And the last Lancastrian king himself was most likely killed in the Tower. The fact that Richard had Edward legally deprived of his claim to the throne was also not unprecedented. The House of York had itself secured the right to the crown through the Act of Accord in 1460. This law had excluded Henry's son, Edward of Westminster, from the succession. At that point, the former crown prince was younger than Richard of Shrewsbury was in 1483. What makes the princes unique are two particular aspects. First, Edward V had already been proclaimed king. He was deposed by his uncle. Yet even that was not entirely without precedent. Henry II's sons had rebelled against him, and John rose up more than once against his brother Richard. Second, the boys were exceptionally young. Edward was only 12 years old, and his brother Richard just 9. However, no known precedent exists for action being taken against such young royal children, especially a reigning king and his brother within the history of the Plantagenet dynasty. Richard justified his actions on the grounds that Edward had not yet been crowned. He had not undergone the divine consecration of kingship, and thus Richard believed he was not directly defying the will of God. That Richard acted against the princes is indisputable. Regardless of their ultimate fate, he stripped the boys of their property, their noble titles, and thus their identities, just as he had done with their sisters. Three things stand out when we look back at this analysis. First, Richard was undoubtedly responsible for actions that contradicted moral standards and can be described as evil. Secondly, however, the vast majority of these actions were not unprecedented. The only true exception lies in the unique combination of the prince's close blood relation to him and their young age. Thirdly, we find that Richard's morally questionable behavior was largely confined to contexts where his own position, his power, his wealth, his security was at stake. When he was not personally affected, he often exceeded the moral expectations of his time. For example, he made it easier for ordinary people to seek justice through the courts. In the North, he had a reputation as a fair judge. He was also well regarded for his efforts to combat crime and for his promotion of trade. So my answer is this. Richard was a man who did evil things, but he was also a man who did good things. However, the good he did is not enough to cast him as a hero. In my view, whether he should be considered truly evil depends on the fate of the princes in the Tower. According to my personal 21st century moral standards, the murders he ordered without due process are already sufficient grounds to view him as evil. But that's not the decisive point. When judged by the standards of his own time, Richard would not have stood out significantly from other kings if he did not kill the princes. However, if he did, it would represent one of the gravest moral violations of the late Middle Ages. In that case, there can be no other conclusion than to consider him evil, even by the standards of the 15th century. As a final thought, good people can do bad things, and bad people can do good things. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.